Deep beneath the sands of Giza, something might be waiting. Or maybe nothing's there at all. That's the strange truth about the pyramids in 2024. We have satellites that can read a license plate from space. We have machines that can peer into the human body and map every organ without a single incision. And yet when it comes to the largest stone structures ever built by human hands, we're still squinting into the dark, arguing about shadows on a screen. Every few years the headlines return. Scientists discover mysterious void inside Great Pyramid. Hidden chamber may hold secrets of ancient Egypt. New scan reveals structure unlike anything seen before. And every single time, something in us lights up. Because what if this is the time they actually find something? What if, underneath all that limestone, there's a room nobody has entered in 4,500 years? If you're using this video to drift off to sleep, that's exactly what it's here for. So go ahead, subscribe if you haven't, and tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. I love checking back and seeing it's 2 a.m. in Lisbon or lunchtime in Manila, all at the exact same moment, all of us listening to the same ancient mystery. Now, here's what we're going to do together tonight. We're going to walk through what these new scans actually detected, using muons, radar, seismic waves, all these strange invisible tools that let scientists see through solid rock. We're going to talk about what the data really shows, not what the headlines want you to believe it shows. Because there's a difference, and it's a bigger difference than you might think. We'll look at the strongest, most careful interpretations from actual Egyptologists and geophysicists. And we'll also look at the wilder theories, the ones that light up the internet but don't hold up so well under real scrutiny. By the end, you'll understand exactly what's plausible, what's speculative, and what's just noise dressed up as discovery. Before we go further, a quick favour. If you're listening on Spotify, following the show helps more than you'd think, and it means you get these episodes without music or ads interrupting your sleep. If you've got a spare moment tomorrow, a 5-star review helps other people find their way here too. There's a link in the description if you want to support that way. Either way, thank you for being here, night after night, drifting off to these strange corners of history. So let's start with what we actually do know. Because before we can talk about hidden structures, we need to understand what's already been mapped, measured, and confirmed beneath the Giza plateau. There are tunnels down there, shafts, pits cut deep into bedrock, an entire buried landscape that most people have never heard of, sitting quietly under one of the most photographed places on Earth. Some of it we've known about for over a century. Some of it we're still piecing together right now. And once you see how much is already confirmed just beneath the surface, the idea of something else waiting in the dark doesn't seem so far-fetched after all. Let's go back to the beginning. Back to when the first archaeologists realized Giza wasn't just pyramids sitting on sand. It was sitting on secrets. This isn't the first time we've heard this story. That's the part that gets lost in the excitement. The pattern repeats itself with almost eerie precision, decade after decade, like the pyramids themselves are running some kind of long, slow con on human curiosity. Here's how it usually goes. A team of researchers, often using new technology, something nobody's tried before, announces they've detected an anomaly, a void, a cavity, something that shouldn't be there according to the standard architectural plans. The press release goes out, careful, hedged, full of words like possible and consistent with, and further investigation needed. And then something strange happens on the way to your news feed. Those careful hedges disappear. Possible void becomes hidden chamber. Consistent with a cavity becomes secret room discovered. By the time it reaches you, scientists aren't investigating an anomaly anymore. They found ancient Egypt's biggest secret. Then, months later, sometimes years later, a quieter follow-up paper comes out. It clarifies, it nuances, it says, Actually, this might just be a construction gap, or a stress-relieving feature, or possibly nothing structurally significant at all. But by then, nobody's watching. The headline already did its job. It already lived in a million minds as fact. This isn't a new phenomenon. Go back to the 1980s and 90s, and you'll find French architect Jean-Pierre Houdin and his team detecting anomalies with microgravimetry, a technique that measures tiny variations in gravitational pull to infer hidden spaces. They found something, everyone got excited. Decades of debate followed about what it actually meant. Go back further to the 1970s, and there were cavity claims tied to early seismic testing. Different tools, different decades, same basic story. Discovery, amplification, quiet correction, repeat. Why does Giza keep doing this to us? Part of it is scale. These aren't small structures where every stone has been catalogued. The Great Pyramid alone contains something like 2 million blocks, weighing an average of 2.5 tons each. There is so much stone, so much volume, that the idea something could be tucked away inside doesn't feel far-fetched. It feels almost statistically likely part of it is symbolism. These aren't just old buildings, they're loaded with 4,000 years of meaning, mythology, conspiracy, and genuine unanswered questions about how an early Bronze Age civilization pulled off engineering feats we'd still find challenging today. When something is already wrapped in mystery, any new anomaly gets absorbed into that mystery instantly. And part of it, honestly, is that excavation at Giza has never been complete. There are areas underneath the plateau that have never been opened, chambers referenced in ancient inscriptions that have never been located, shafts that stop for no clear reason. Incomplete knowledge leaves room for imagination to fill in the gaps. And imagination given an inch will happily take a mile. So here's a distinction worth holding on to as we go deeper into this. There's a real difference between an unknown, something we simply haven't figured out yet, an anomaly, a specific measurable signal that doesn't match our expectations, and an extraordinary claim, a leap from that anomaly, to something like a hidden chamber full of artifacts, or worse, evidence of some lost, forgotten civilization. All three of these get lumped together in headlines. They shouldn't be. An anomaly is data. An extraordinary claim is a story built on top of that data, sometimes with evidence, sometimes with nothing but hope. The trick, the thing that lets you enjoy this mystery without getting swept away by it, is learning to sit in that space between wonder and rigour, to ask what if without insisting on yes. And to do that, we need to understand exactly what these scanning tools are measuring, and more importantly, what they simply cannot tell us. Before we talk about tools, we need to talk about the thing they're actually looking through. Because the pyramids don't float in empty space. They're sitting on a very specific kind of rock, with a very specific kind of history, and that history quietly shapes almost every mystery signal we see. The Giza Plateau is limestone, not one smooth uniform slab, but a stack of different limestone beds laid down when this part of Egypt was under a shallow sea tens of millions of years ago, layer after layer of ancient seafloor, full of shells, microfossils and fine sediments, all compressed into stone. Those layers aren't equal. Some are dense, hard, and relatively clean. Others are softer, more porous, full of clay, or riddled with fossil fragments. Even within a single layer, density can shift over just a few meters. One patch might be tight and fine-grained. A few steps away, the same bed could be full of tiny voids and chalky pockets. To a scanning tool, those differences matter. A denser layer slows down seismic waves and blocks some radar signals. A more porous layer lets them through differently. A patch of limestone that was once a dense reef can show up one way, while a layer of fine mudstone right above it shows up another way. You're not looking at stone versus empty. You're looking at a zebra pattern of subtly different rocks, each with its own fingerprint. On top of that, limestone has a particular habit. It doesn't like water, at least not in the way granite does. Put water in contact with limestone long enough, and the rock slowly dissolves. Rainfall, groundwater, even occasional flooding from the Nile over thousands of years. All of that can carve the plateau from the inside. This is where karst comes in. Karst is the term geologists use for landscapes formed by the dissolution of soluble rocks like limestone. Think fissures, solution channels, small caves, and irregular voids. Not dramatic underground cathedrals necessarily, but a three-dimensional maze of cracks, widened joints and pockets where rock used to be and water once moved. At Giza, this kind of karstic activity has had a very long time to work. Natural fractures opened along lines of weakness. Water seeped in, widened them, connected them. Some of those voids later filled with sediment again. Others stayed hollow. Some are only a few centimetres across. Others can be large enough to stand in. None of them were designed by humans, but they can still look like rooms to an instrument that only sees contrasts in density or wave speed. Add to that the fact that the plateau is cut by natural joints and faults. These are essentially pre-existing crack systems in the rock, often roughly parallel or intersecting at angles, extending for many meters. When weathering and water get into those joints, they preferentially erode along those lines, sometimes creating long, straight features underground. Now imagine looking at that with a scanner. You send in waves or particles and get back a pattern of something is different here along a line or in a patch. That something could be a beautifully carved human corridor. It could also be a naturally widened joint following a fault plane, filled with looser material, or an old solution channel partly collapsed and refilled. Water isn't just carving the rock, it's also changing its physical characteristics in the present. Moisture content affects electrical conductivity, radar reflectivity, and even the way seismic waves travel. Salts dissolved in that water, especially sulfates and chlorides common in desert environments, can crystallize inside the pores of the stone. When they do, they expand, crack the rock, and create microfractures. Those salts also change how the rock behaves in scans. Salty, damp zones can look dramatically different from dry, compact limestone a few meters away. A mysterious anomaly might just be an area where groundwater pooled centuries ago, left behind a concentration of salts, and slowly broke the stone down from the inside. Over time, the upper surface of the plateau has been sculpted by all of this water, wind, salt, and temperature changes. The result is an irregular bedrock topography, ridges, steps, pockets, and depressions, some of them now buried under pyramid fill, masonry, and sand. When you run a scan through that kind of surface, the scanner sees interfaces, the boundary where dense bedrock meets looser fill, the place where a natural hollow was packed with quarry debris, a step in the original rock surface that's now hidden under casing blocks. To the instrument, those are sharp changes in material properties. On a processed image, sharp changes often resolve into straight lines, planes, or discrete bodies from a distance in a published figure that can look a lot like a wall, a floor, or a void with regular boundaries. In reality, it might be the uneven contact between an ancient eroded rock step and the rough core blocks poured in against it. Or a natural depression, the builders levelled by dumping rubble into it before laying the pyramid's first course. And that brings in another crucial layer. The quarrying and cuttings humans did long before modern scanners arrived. The Egyptians didn't just place their pyramids on any random patch of rock. They cut into the plateau, squared off certain areas, smoothed others, and left behind trenches, ramps, and extraction pits. In some cases they quarried stone directly from around and even underneath where the pyramid would rise, then backfilled or built over those scars. We can still see some of these quarries on the surface today. Wide open cuts, stepped faces, and strange rectangular hollows whose purpose is debated. Others are now buried beneath later construction. Archaeologists who work at Giza are very aware of this palimpsest of cuts and fills. Old maps, excavation records, and recent ground surveys show a landscape that was heavily modified before, during, and after pyramid building. To a scanner, an old quarry cut backfilled with looser debris is a classic anomaly. So is a construction ramp buried under later masonry. So is a deep pit used for ritual boats, or a shaft tomb carved into the bedrock and then sealed. None of these are hidden in the sense of unknown human activity at Giza. We have plenty of examples of them across the plateau. But if you don't already know that similar features exist, the first time you see a density contrast shaped like a rectangle, it's easy to jump straight to secret chamber. So when a new scan team announces a void or cavity, there are at least 3 broad categories on the table before we ever get to treasure rooms. 1. Natural geology, karst voids, widened joints, irregular layering. 2. Physical changes in the rock, water salts, weathering zones that alter how waves and particles behave. 3. Human modifications to the bedrock, quarry cuts, ramps, pits, and filled depressions, all of which can mimic neat geometric structures in the data. Understanding that doesn't make the mystery go away. It just anchors it. It reminds us that any scan at Giza is reading a conversation between human architecture and an old, complicated piece of Earth's crust. To understand the tools, we have to understand that conversation. So now, with that ground beneath our mental feet, we can finally turn to the instruments themselves. What exactly are they measuring, and how do we get from raw signals in stone to dramatic diagrams of possible hidden spaces inside the pyramids? When people hear scan, they tend to imagine something like an X-ray of a suitcase at the airport. You see a clean outline of a laptop, a neat rectangle for a book, a bottle, a pair of scissors. Clear shapes, obvious objects. If there's a hidden compartment, the image shows it instantly. Subsurface scanning around the pyramids is not like that. What these tools actually measure is much more abstract. They don't see blocks or corridors or sarcophagi. They see differences in density, in how waves travel, in how electric currents prefer one path over another. From those differences we build models, and from those models, if we're not very careful, we build stories. Let's start with the technique that sounds the most exotic, muography or muon imaging. Muons are tiny particles created high in Earth's atmosphere when cosmic rays hit. They rain down constantly, passing through you, through buildings, through mountains, and through pyramids. Most of them don't care. They go straight on. But the thicker and denser the material they pass through, the more get absorbed or deflected. Muography uses that fact. You put very sensitive detectors in a fixed position, often inside or just under a structure, and you just wait. Day after day you count how many muons arrive from each direction. If one region of the pyramid has slightly fewer muons arriving from behind it than you'd expect, that suggests more dense material in that direction. If another region has slightly more muons than expected, that suggests a lower density zone, less stone, more air, or more rubble. The key word there is density. Not a chamber, but a place where there seems to be less mass than the surrounding rock. If you've already decided there must be a hidden room, that signal looks like confirmation. If you remember the karst voids, the old quarries, the filled ramps, it's just one more piece of a very crowded puzzle. Next, ground-penetrating radar, often shortened to GPR. GPR works by sending short bursts of radio waves into the ground and listening for echoes. Whenever those waves hit a boundary where the material's electrical properties change, say from dry limestone to a damp, salty patch, or from compact bedrock to a pocket of loose sand, part of the energy bounces back. The equipment records the timing and strength of those echoes. So what does GPR actually see? It sees contrasts in what's called dielectric permittivity, how easily the material can be polarized by the radio wave. Dense, dry limestone behaves one way. Moist clay behaves another. Voids, rubble, mortar, weathered zones, they each give different reflection patterns. But again, it's not directly drawing a room. It's drawing a sheet of wiggles, curves and spikes that an operator then interprets. A strong, flat, continuous reflector might be the top of bedrock, or the boundary between pyramid core blocks and foundation, or the roof of an ancient trench that's now filled. A zone with weak, chaotic reflections might be a void, or just heavily fractured rock, or a patch full of salts. Seismic methods add another layer. Instead of radio waves, they use mechanical waves, vibrations. You create a small shock at the surface with a hammer, a weight drop, or specialized equipment, and you measure how quickly the resulting waves travel through the subsurface and bounce back from interfaces. Seismic waves move faster through stiff, compact rock, and slower through looser or more fractured material. So, when you map their travel times, you're mapping stiffness and wave speed. A zone where waves slow down might be a cavity, or a fault zone, or a highly weathered layer, or just a pocket of rubble. A strong reflector could be the top of solid bedrock or the ceiling of some old construction cut. Electrical resistivity methods work differently again. Electrodes are placed on the surface and currents are sent into the ground. By measuring how easily the current flows between different electrode combinations, you can infer how conductive the subsurface materials are. Dry, unfractured limestone resists current. It's a good insulator. Moist, clay-rich or salty zones conduct better. Rubble with lots of pore space can also be relatively conductive if it holds moisture. So resistivity surveys are mostly mapping how the subsurface deals with electric charge. A high resistivity zone might be solid rock or dry fill. A low resistivity anomaly might be a water-rich fracture network, or a backfilled pit, or the boundary between two rock types with different pore structures. None of these tools has a little label that pops up saying, tunnel here, natural cave here, ceremonial boat pit here. They produce fields of numbers. Those numbers get turned into graphs, then into cross-sections, then into colourful images. At each step, from raw signal to final picture, choices are made. How densely do you sample? How do you filter noise? Which algorithm do you use to turn time delays into depth estimates? What assumptions do you bake into the model about rock properties? Even the colour scale matters. If you pick a palette where slight differences show up as violently contrasting reds and blues, the final image looks dramatic, full of sharp, meaningful seeming features. Use a more muted scale, and the same data suddenly looks like subtle fuzzy gradations. Resolution and depth limits add another layer of uncertainty. Muography can penetrate deep, even through an entire pyramid, but its resolution is relatively coarse. It's good at saying somewhere in this large region the average density is a bit lower, not here is a crisp 1 meter wide tunnel. GPR can have very fine resolution near the surface, but it fades quickly with depth, especially in conductive or very heterogeneous rock. Seismic surveys can see deeper, but the images get blurrier because waves scatter and bend in complex ways. Resistivity can outline broad zones of different conductivity, but the exact shapes of those zones are always somewhat smeared and model dependent. On paper, or in a 3D visualization, all of that complexity can vanish. The final result is a neat block model with sharp edges and labelled bodies. A bright, clean void appears over here. A compact, high-density core appears over there. It looks authoritative. It looks like an X-ray. But underneath that polished picture is a long stack of assumptions and a lot of geological possibilities that fit the same signals. That's why best practice in this kind of work is almost boringly cautious. You don't trust one method alone. You triangulate. If a muon survey suggests a low-density zone, you ask, does Seismic see a slow velocity patch there? Does GPR show an unusual reflection pattern at the same depth? Does resistivity suggest something odd in that footprint? Do old excavation plans or geological maps show a known quarry cut, a shaft or a natural depression in that area? And even then, you haven't found a room. You've found a consistent anomaly. To move from anomaly to interpretation, archaeologists look for ground truth, direct evidence. That might mean correlating the signal with an already accessible chamber nearby, or, if the anomaly is compelling and the risks are acceptable, drilling a very small borehole or inserting a fibre optic camera through an existing joint to see what's actually there. Sometimes the glamorous void turns out to be exactly what the headlines hoped for, a deliberate space. More often it's a pocket of rubble, a natural cavity, or a messy human cut that never made it into the simple diagrams. The tools are not lying. They're doing exactly what they're designed to do, measure physical contrasts. But the step from something here is different to we've discovered a secret chamber under the pyramid is a human leap. In the next sections, we'll look at how that leap plays out specifically with muon scans, radar profiles and seismic surveys at Giza, and how myths can grow in the gap between the data and the drill bit. Muon imaging sounds like something out of science fiction, but the basic idea is surprisingly straightforward. Imagine the pyramid sitting under a constant, invisible rain of muons. They stream down from the sky, through the stone, and into the detectors, which are quietly counting, second after second, month after month. From each direction you get a tally. Over time, a pattern emerges. If you point toward a region made of solid, dense limestone, fewer muons make it through. It's like shining a flashlight through fog. The thicker the fog, the dimmer the beam on the other side. If you point toward a region that has less mass in the way, more air, more rubble, fewer blocks, more muons arrive than your model predicted. That's what researchers call a void signal. It doesn't mean a clean rectangular room with a door and paintings on the wall. It means along this line of sight, between the sky and the detector, the average density is lower than expected. That's it. Less mass, not automatic architecture. And even that simple statement rests on a scaffold of assumptions. To say that a region has more or fewer muons than expected, you first have to decide what expected looks like. You need a baseline model of the pyramid, its overall shape, the thickness of its walls, the location of known chambers, the density you assume for its stone. You need to know how many muons should arrive from each angle if everything were perfectly solid and uniform. Change the model, and the definition of unexpected changes with it. Detector placement matters too. Most muon detectors can't float wherever you want inside the pyramid. They sit in corridors, in accessible chambers, or at the base. Each detector sees the structure from a particular vantage point through a thick cone of stone. Any anomaly it detects lies somewhere along that cone. It's a bit like standing in a forest and noticing a slightly brighter patch of sky between the branches. You know there's a gap in the canopy somewhere in that direction, but not exactly how far away it is, or whether it's a tidy circular hole or a long, ragged tier. To figure that out, you need more viewpoints, more detectors, more time. Exposure time is another quiet complication. Muons are abundant but not infinite. To pick up subtle differences, say a few percent more muons from one direction than another, you need a lot of counts. That means leaving the detectors in place for months, sometimes years, and slowly watching the statistics converge. Short exposures can be noisy. A feature that looks like a clear void early on may soften or shift as more data comes in. Peaks flatten, valleys fill, and some of the most exciting spots fade into the background. Then there are modelling assumptions. To turn raw muon counts into a map of density, you have to simulate how muons move through stone, how many are absorbed per metre, how their angles spread, how energy losses vary with path length. Those calculations depend on physics that is well understood in the lab, but the pyramid isn't a controlled lab sample. Its stone is layered. Some blocks are denser than others. There are joints, fractures, mortar, weathered zones, and historical disturbances. If your model treats the mass as more uniform than it really is, some of that messy variability can masquerade as a void. With all those caveats, what did muon studies at Khufu's Great Pyramid actually find? Over the past decade, different teams have placed detectors in and around the known chambers. They all saw the big spaces we already knew: the King's Chamber, the Grand Gallery, the Queen's Chamber. That's an important sanity check. The method is sensitive enough to pick up large cavities in roughly the right places, with roughly the right sizes. But one study, widely publicised, also reported something new. A region above the Grand Gallery where more muons arrived than expected. A low-density zone. A void. In their scientific papers, the researchers were careful. They spoke of a large void of unknown function, of a feature that could be a single big space, several smaller adjacent spaces, a corridor, or some combination of structural gaps. They didn't claim a hidden burial chamber. They didn't claim a treasure room. They described a volume of reduced density comparable in scale to the Grand Gallery, whose precise shape and origin were not yet known. What they did not prove was that this volume is a finished, intentional room with walls, a floor, and decorated surfaces. They did not prove a new entrance, a secret passage, or a specific ritual purpose. They didn't even prove that the void is empty air. It could be partially filled with lighter material, stepped construction spaces, or multiple small relieving cavities designed to take weight off whatever lies below. In other words, the muons say, there's less mass here than we thought, not behold a lost hall of kings. That distinction tends to blur as the story flows outward. A cautious large void of unknown nature in a technical paper becomes massive hidden chamber in some headlines, then secret burial complex in the more imaginative corners of the internet. Each retelling adds one more layer of certainty that wasn't in the data. This is why follow-up methods and careful language matter so much. If a muon study highlights an intriguing low-density region, the logical next step is to bring in other tools with different sensitivities. Can a targeted seismic survey detect a matching low-velocity zone in the same footprint? Does high-frequency radar, where accessible, show a consistent reflection at a depth that would correspond to a ceiling? Do electrical methods hint at a dry cavity or a zone of broken moisture-holding rubble? If multiple independent techniques, each with its own biases and blind spots, converge on the same anomaly, confidence grows. You move from a single model-dependent hint to a pattern. Even then, researchers who work in this space tend to phrase their conclusions in deliberately dry ways, consistent with a sizable cavity, compatible with the presence of a low-density structure, suggestive of an internal space. It can sound almost disappointingly cautious, especially when everyone is hoping for something dramatic. But that restraint is the guardrail that keeps us from driving off into fantasy. On the other side of that guardrail is the temptation to treat every density deficit as a doorway and every anomaly as a revelation. When you're primed to expect secret chambers, any patch of missing mass looks like a blueprint. When you remember the messy geology beneath Giza, the complex engineering inside the pyramid, and the limits of the instruments, that same patch becomes a question instead of an answer. In the next section, we'll step away from the muons and look at the other heavy hitters: ground-penetrating radar and seismic surveys. They operate on completely different physical principles, but they face the same problem: turning fields of numbers into stories without letting those stories run too far ahead of the ground truth. If muons are like counting raindrops, ground-penetrating radar is more like shouting into the ground and listening for the echo. The principle is simple. You send short pulses of radio waves down into the subsurface. Every time those waves hit a boundary between materials with different electrical properties, say dry sand over wet sand, or solid limestone over a pocket of loose rubble, some of the energy bounces back. You record the time it takes to return, and how strong the reflection is. Do that again and again along a line, and you build up a cross-section, a radar profile of what lies beneath your feet. On paper, it sounds like the perfect tool for pyramid mysteries. If there's a chamber under the courtyard, surely the radar will see a clean, flat ceiling, a sharp, tidy rectangle, a bright outline just waiting to be labelled hidden room. But the ground under Giza doesn't play along so neatly. Giza's bedrock is layered limestone, full of subtle changes in density, cementation, and moisture. Some beds are slightly more clay-rich, others are more porous. Over millions of years, water has seeped through, dissolving tiny pathways, opening microscopic pores, leaving behind veins and patches of different material. On top of that, you have centuries of human activity: cut blocks, backfilled pits, old excavation trenches, rubble dumped and compacted. To a radar pulse, all of these are contrasts. Each boundary, each change in moisture or porosity throws back a small echo. Stack enough of them together, and your nice clean radogram becomes a tangle of arcs, streaks and bands. Trained geophysicists learn to read patterns in that tangle. But it's very easy, especially if you're eager for a discovery, to look at a few strong reflections and see shapes that feel architectural. A horizontal reflector might be a ceiling, or it might be the contact between two limestone beds with slightly different water content. A bright, curved feature might look like the top of a tunnel, or it might be the edge of an old quarry cut, later backfilled with looser debris that holds more moisture than the stone around it. Rubble is especially tricky. Many pyramid-adjacent structures sit on foundations where builders leveled the bedrock, filled low spots with broken stone, and then laid blocks on top. Radar loves that kind of contrast: solid bedrock, then a zone of mixed rubble and air, then big carved stones. Each change generates reflections. When you slice through that with a survey line, the result can easily mimic the layered roof-void floor pattern you'd expect from a buried space, even if what you're really seeing is just construction fill. Seismic methods attack the problem from a different angle. Instead of radio waves, they use mechanical vibrations, elastic waves that travel through the ground. You create a pulse at the surface with a hammer, a weight drop, or more sophisticated equipment, and then listen with sensors called geophones or accelerometers. The waves move faster through stiff, intact rock and slower through loose, fractured, or less dense material. If there's a genuine air-filled void, some wave types will speed around it. Others will reflect sharply off the boundary, and the shadow of that cavity shows up as delays and distortions in the recorded signals. If there's just a zone of broken, cracked limestone, the waves slow down, scatter, and lose energy. To the processing software, both situations might look like a low-velocity anomaly, a place where things don't transmit vibrations the way the surrounding rock does. In principle, this is powerful. Void detection is one of the classic uses of near-surface seismics. In practice, again, Giza complicates the picture. Limestone shot through with natural fractures can behave a lot like partially loosened backfill. Old quarry faces cut and then weathered can be heavily cracked. Faults, joints, and subtle changes in cementation all influence wave speeds. Seismic records are also affected by surface conditions: loose sand, paving stones, buried pipes, the presence or absence of water in pores. Any of these can generate travel time anomalies that, when contoured into pretty colour maps, look remarkably like the outline of a tunnel or chamber. Common false positives show up again and again in technical reports. Layering, natural bedding planes that produce repeated, parallel reflectors. Moisture pockets, slightly wetter zones in otherwise dry rock, which change both radar response and seismic velocities. Rubble fill ancient or modern backfill, which is less dense and more heterogeneous than the host rock. Cut stone interfaces, the contact between carved blocks and the bedrock, or between different phases of construction, which can form sharp linear features in data that tempt the eye into tracing them as corridors. None of these are imaginary, they are real structures. They just aren't necessarily the kind of structure people most want to hear about. This is where good reporting becomes crucial. In a careful geophysical paper, you don't just see a single dramatic image with a red blob labelled possible chamber. You see the full radar profiles, line by line, with scales and acquisition parameters, antenna frequency, step spacing, processing filters. You see seismic sections with clearly marked travel time picks, velocity models and estimates of uncertainty. There are usually boring tables, how repeatable the measurements were, what happened when the same line was collected twice, how sensitive the interpretation is to small changes in assumed rock properties. Error bars matter here. If a reflector's interpreted depth is 10 meters plus or minus 2, that's a very different claim than exactly 10.0 meters. If a low velocity zone is only significant at, say, the 1 sigma level, barely outside the noise, you treat it as a hint, not a headline. Good reporting also cross-checks. Do radar and seismic results line up in position and depth? Do they coincide with known geological contacts or old excavation maps? Has someone tried a different processing approach to see if the feature persists, or does it vanish when a filter is changed? By the time these careful, hedged conclusions make their way into the popular imagination, most of that scaffolding is gone. A fuzzy patch in a radogram becomes a rectangular chamber. A smeared seismic anomaly becomes a tunnel system. The raw data, which looked like a dense barcode of echoes and wiggles, gets redrawn as tidy outlines and straight edges. But the instruments don't actually see walls. They don't see doorways. They don't see hieroglyphs or sarcophagi. They measure differences in dielectric constant, in wave speed, in reflectivity. Those differences can be contoured, shaded, and sliced into shapes that our brains instantly want to interpret as human-made geometry. We're pattern-seeking creatures. Give us a cloud and we'll find a castle. A rectangular anomaly in a processed scan doesn't prove 4 right-angled, chiseled blocks of stone. It might reflect the way the survey grid was laid out, the interpolation between data points, or the natural tendency of layered rock to produce quasi-planar features. The more you simplify and smooth the data for public consumption, the more architectural everything starts to look. So when you hear that radar shows a room or that seismic surveys reveal a tunnel, it's worth mentally translating that back into the more modest language of the field. We see a zone where the subsurface behaves differently, whose shape within the limits of our resolution could be compatible with a cavity. That's not nothing. It's exactly the kind of clue archaeologists need to plan careful, targeted work. But it's a long way from a fully mapped intentional structure. In the next section, we'll look at how some of these subtle anomalies, filtered through headlines and imagination, have been turned into the latest wave of new scans prove hidden structures stories, and how much, or how little the underlying data actually supports those claims. So what are people actually saying these new scans have found? If you scroll through the recent wave of stories, a few themes repeat like a chorus. There are the tunnel claims, elongated anomalies under causeways or along the flanks of the plateau, framed as secret passageways linking pyramids, temples, and unknown destinations. Sometimes they're described as corridors running parallel to known structures. Sometimes as cross-cutting tunnels that supposedly pierce the bedrock in straight, purposeful lines. Then there are the chamber claims, discrete, more compact anomalies, zones of different density or reflectivity, drawn as rooms beneath courtyards, under pyramid bases, or inside the body of the pyramids themselves. These often get described as previously unknown voids, large cavities, or hidden rooms. In the retelling, the qualifier possible tends to quietly disappear. Finally, there are the subsurface structures under the plateau, layered or blocky patterns in the data, interpreted as buried walls, massive foundations, or even remnants of an older pre-pyramid construction phase. These sometimes get bundled into larger narratives about a city beneath Giza or an underground complex stretching far beyond the visible monuments. All of these stories usually trace back to a smaller set of technical efforts, muon imaging projects focused on the Great Pyramid, assorted radar and seismic surveys around its base and nearby monuments, and broader geophysical mapping campaigns across parts of the plateau. The same handful of anomalies can spawn dozens of different headlines. To understand what's really been claimed, it helps to separate three layers of communication that often get mashed together: the peer-reviewed literature, the institutional or press summaries, and the social media extrapolations. At the peer-reviewed end, the language is dry and cautious. A muon tomography study might report anomalous excess of counts compatible with a cavity of at least X cubic meters. A radar paper might describe a laterally continuous high-amplitude reflector tentatively interpreted as a possible void or low-density zone. Depths come with uncertainty ranges. Shapes are described with words like approximately, subparallel, within resolution limits. These papers usually stop at the level of physics. There is a zone that behaves differently from its surroundings. They may offer several interpretations: a natural void, a constructional feature, disturbed rock, backfill. Chamber and tunnel are often framed as one hypothesis among several, not as a conclusion. Then come institutional releases and conference presentations. Here the language starts to loosen. A cautious anomaly consistent with a cavity can turn into evidence of a large void. Talk slides will show simplified diagrams, sometimes shaded in ways that visually emphasize neat, artificial-looking shapes. You might see phrases like unknown function or not aligned with known internal structures, which sound mysterious even when they simply mean we haven't connected this blip to a mapped feature yet. Nothing has been falsified at this stage, but the emphasis shifts. The most newsworthy interpretation rises to the surface. Less exciting possibilities like infilled construction trench or zone of fractured limestone may be listed but rarely headline-worthy. Finally, there's the social media layer, where most of us actually encounter these stories. Here, evidence of a large void becomes scientists confirm giant hidden chamber. A radar high-amplitude reflector morphs into clearly defined rectangular room. A cluster of anomalies aligned in the same general direction gets rendered as a ruler straight tunnel system, sometimes with speculative maps extending far beyond what any survey actually covered. Words like suggest and indicate are important here, because in scientific writing they don't mean what casual conversation often assumes. When a paper says the data suggest a cavity, it doesn't mean the authors believe one definitely exists. It means that, given the method, resolution, noise level and assumptions, A cavity is one plausible model that fits the observed anomaly better than some alternatives. Indicate is a little stronger, often used when multiple independent methods point in the same direction, but it still falls short of prove. Both words signal degrees of support, not certainty. You can think of it as a sliding scale. At the bottom, consistent with, then suggest, then indicate. Only after a lot of cross-checking and ideally direct verification does anything get close to demonstrate. Public retellings often skip that scale entirely. Suggest gets read as show and indicate as reveal. Part of the problem is what's missing from most popular accounts. The raw data, those dense radar profiles and muon count charts, are rarely accessible or easy to interpret without training. Details about acquisition methods, antenna frequencies, survey geometries, and processing choices are compressed into a line or two, if they're mentioned at all. Error estimates and sensitivity tests, which tell you how robust an anomaly is, usually vanish somewhere between the PDF and the press release. Independent replication is another quiet absence. In an ideal world, a strong claim, say a major void inside a pyramid, gets followed by repeat surveys using different methods and teams, ideally with overlapping coverage. In reality, logistical constraints, limited access and funding mean that some of the most talked about anomalies rest on a surprisingly small number of datasets. When they are revisited, the follow-up sometimes appears in specialized venues and never reaches the wider audience that heard the initial claim. So when you hear that new scans have found tunnels or chambers under Giza, what's usually behind that sentence is something more modest. One or a few surveys have detected zones where the ground behaves differently, and some of those zones could, under certain assumptions, be modelled as man-made cavities. That's still interesting. It's exactly the kind of signal archaeologists hope to find when planning careful work. But it leaves a lot of room for more ordinary explanations. Natural voids in the limestone, ancient quarries and construction cuts, backfilled shafts, or structural features we already know exist in large numbers under the plateau. In the next sections, we'll pull back from the headlines and look at that context. What subterranean features are already well documented at Giza, how pyramid builders actually shaped the ground they were working on, and how those very real, very human activities might produce the kinds of anomalies modern instruments are picking up today. If you could strip away the sand and the modern buildings and just look at the Giza plateau in cross-section, it wouldn't look like three lonely pyramids on a flat rock. It would look chewed up, layered, carved into and plugged again, like a piece of woodworking that's been drilled, mortised, and patched over centuries of use. Because Giza isn't just a set of monuments sitting on a natural hill. It's a built landscape. The bedrock itself has been treated almost like a construction material, shaped and hollowed to match religious needs, engineering logic, and simple practicality. Start with the most basic elements, tombs. Around the pyramids spread fields of mastabas, those low rectangular tomb superstructures that from the surface look like solid blocks of stone. But under many of them, shafts plunge down into the bedrock, sometimes several meters, sometimes much deeper, opening into burial chambers cut directly from the limestone. In some areas, these shafts cluster so densely that the rock below becomes a honeycomb of vertical cuts and horizontal galleries. Some are single burials, others have side chambers for family members. A few are multi-level, with one shaft opening into a small underworld of interconnected rooms and corridors. Add to that the later intrusive burials, people reusing old spaces, cutting new shafts near older ones, or even breaking into earlier tombs. Over time, the plateau became a layered necropolis, with generations stacking their dead into the same patches of rock. From a geophysics perspective, that means large sections of the solid plateau are actually highly disturbed. You get voids, backfilled shafts, zones of fractured rock, and places where quarrymen and tomb builders cut so close together that only thin walls of limestone separate one cavity from another. On top of this, Giza was also an industrial zone. Much of the stone used to build the pyramids was quarried right out of the plateau itself. Those quarries aren't always neat, open pits. Some are long extraction trenches later filled back in. Others are stepped cuts sunk partly below ground level, then re-landscaped or built over when they were no longer needed. Some of the mysterious subsurface signatures people talk about today line up quite well with the areas where we know ancient quarrying took place. A backfilled extraction trench or an old quarry face can look, to a radar or seismic survey, very much like a long linear structure. Then there are the boat pits. Around the Great Pyramid and other major monuments, archaeologists have found long, narrow, stone-lined pits, some empty, some containing disassembled wooden boats like the famous Khufu ship. These weren't everyday vessels. They seem to have had a ritual function connected to the king's journey with the sun god, or his travel in the afterlife. Whether they were ever meant to touch water in a practical sense is still debated, but their symbolic purpose as vehicles of transition is hard to miss. Why do boat pits matter for hidden structure expectations? Because they show that the builders weren't just thinking vertically, pyramid above, tomb below. They were laying out elongated, carefully cut spaces partly or wholly below the original ground surface, in positions that respond to religious ideas as much as to topography. If you run a modern survey across the eastern or southern side of the Great Pyramid, and your instruments pick up a long, narrow, low-density zone aligned with the monument, a boat pit is one entirely reasonable candidate. It's not a secret subway system, it's a known type of feature, even if that specific example hasn't been excavated yet. The same goes for causeways and temples. Each of the major pyramids was linked to the Nile floodplain by a raised causeway, connecting a valley temple near the river to a mortuary temple at the pyramid's edge. On the surface, these can look like massive ramps or covered passageways. But their interaction with the ground is more complex. Foundations for these long corridors are often cut into the bedrock. In some places, the builders created retaining walls and substructures, partly below the original terrain to stabilize the path. Drainage channels could be carved into or under the causeways to handle rare but catastrophic rainfall. Valley temples, down near the edge of the ancient floodplain, sometimes sit on deep foundations or incorporate earlier, levelled quarry cuts. Mortuary temples higher up may reuse or slice into older tomb fields. In a few cases, later constructions cut right across earlier burial zones, creating stacked layers of architecture and voids. What this means is that something underneath the causeway doesn't automatically scream hidden tunnel. It might be a foundation trench, a drainage feature, an earlier tomb shaft the builders bridged over, or a quarry cut that was repurposed and invisible from the surface. Add to all this a practical constraint: archaeology at Giza is incomplete, and in some places old. Many parts of the plateau were first dug decades ago, even more than a century ago, under very different standards than those used today. Notes can be sparse. Precise maps of minor features weren't always made. Some shafts were cleared and reburied, others were only partially explored. Modern teams often have to reconstruct what happened from patchy records, field sketches or brief reports. In some zones, especially under modern infrastructure or in areas still occupied by the local cemetery and village, excavation simply isn't possible right now. Those spaces remain largely untested by traditional archaeology, even if surface features are known. Geophysical surveys sometimes target exactly these awkward areas, places where you can't just dig a trench to find out what's there. When the instruments detect anomalies under such spots, the signal is genuinely new, even if the type of feature it likely represents is not. So when you put this all together, the shafts, the galleries, the quarry cuts, the boat pits, the under-causeway foundations, you end up with a clear picture. The idea that there's something below large parts of Giza is not only plausible, it's almost expected. The plateau has been systematically modified in 3 dimensions for centuries of active use, then quietly reused and repurposed for millennia afterward. What would be extraordinary is not the existence of cavities or linear features beneath the surface, but their absence. The challenge and the excitement lies in the details. Is a given anomaly a new shaft, an unrecognized boat pit, an old quarry trench, or something we haven't seen before at this site? Is it part of a pattern we already understand? Or does it gently bend the story of how the Egyptians organized their sacred landscape? To answer those questions, we need to understand not just where the voids might be, but how the pyramids themselves were engineered and what kinds of internal spaces the builders intentionally created, and just as importantly, what they almost never did. When most people hear hidden chamber inside a pyramid, they picture a kind of stone beehive. Dozens of rooms, secret corridors spiraling down into darkness, maybe a whole underground city waiting for the right scan to reveal it. The reality is almost the opposite. The big old kingdom pyramids are surprisingly simple on the inside, and that simplicity is not an accident. It's the result of very careful engineering and a very specific religious focus. Take the Great Pyramid as the clearest example, because we know it best. Khufu's pyramid doesn't have dozens of chambers. It has a small number of deliberately placed spaces tied together by narrow passages. There's the so-called Subterranean chamber, cut down into the bedrock beneath the pyramid's base. There's the descending passage leading to it, and the ascending passage that branches off and climbs up into the body of the pyramid itself. That ascending passage connects to what we call the Queen's Chamber, and then continues upward again into the Grand Gallery, that tall, steeply sloping corridor with its corbelled stone vault. At the end of the Grand Gallery lies the King's Chamber, a rectangular granite room near the pyramid's centre of mass, with a flat ceiling made of enormous granite beams. Above that, stacked one on top of another, are the so-called relieving chambers, 5 low, cramped spaces separated by heavy stone slabs, capped by a pointed corbelled roof. That's it. No underground maze, no multi-level office complex for priests. A handful of key spaces placed along a small number of axes, with a few oddities like the narrow air shafts from the king's and queen's chambers that probably had symbolic or ritual alignment functions, whatever practical role they may or may not have had. And that general pattern holds for other major pyramids, even though the details change. Djoser's Step Pyramid at Saqqara, older than Giza, has a more labyrinthine underground network, with galleries and magazines radiating off. But by the time we get to Sneferu, the king just before Khufu, and his pyramids at Meidum and Dahshur, we already see the shift toward a more focused layout, a few main chambers, a few main passages, sometimes at different levels, sometimes changing orientation, all bound up with the need to manage the massive weight of stone above. Because here's the key engineering problem. A pyramid is a mountain of rock you're asking to sit quietly over a few relatively fragile spaces. Stone is strong under compression, but it's not magic. If you carve a big hollow void in the wrong place, and then stack millions of tons of blocks over it, gravity will eventually have something to say. The ancient builders understood this in practice, even if they didn't talk about load paths and stress distribution the way engineers do now. They knew that certain shapes and placements of voids were safe, and others were dangerous. So they did 2 things at once. First, they anchored the main burial chamber either in the bedrock under the pyramid, or in a carefully chosen zone within the masonry where the load could be controlled. Earlier pyramids tend to put the burial chamber below the original ground level. Later ones, like Khufu's, move it higher into the structure but compensate with smarter load management. Second, they used voids themselves as tools to manage stress. Those relieving chambers above the king's chamber are a perfect example. They aren't extra rooms for secret rituals, they're sacrificial spaces. By stacking flat granite roofs with small gaps between them, the builders created layers that could crack, deform, or redirect forces, taking the brunt of the pressure so the main chamber below stayed intact. The corbelled roof over the grand gallery does something similar. By stepping each course of stone slightly inward, they spread the load sideways into the surrounding masonry, instead of allowing it to press straight down into open space. In other words, not all voids are surprises. Some are built-in safety valves. When modern scans pick up compact horizontal cavities above a known chamber, one entirely reasonable interpretation is relieving space. Not a secret library, but an invisible part of the building's skeleton. But there's an equally important flip side to this. Because the Egyptians were using voids so carefully to keep the structure stable, they were also very careful about where they did not put them. You don't see great tangled labyrinths bored deep into the bedrock directly under the heaviest part of a finished pyramid. You don't see long wandering tunnels passing under the core for no clear purpose. When earlier experiments produced structural headaches, like the Maidum pyramid's collapse or the internal cracking in Sneferu's bent pyramid, the reaction in later projects is not add more tunnels, it's the opposite. Simplify, regularize, and tighten control over where spaces go. Design also changes over time and from site to site. Early on, at places like Saqqara, underground elements are more extensive, sometimes including long galleries and storage rooms. At Dahshur in Giza, the trend moves toward putting more of the functional and symbolic complexity outside the core of the pyramid, in the mortuary and valley temples, in satellite pyramids, in causeways, while keeping the main body of the monument comparatively restrained. At other sites and later dynasties, especially when we move into rock-cut tombs in the Valley of the Kings, you do start seeing long corridors, multiple chambers, branching rooms. But those are hollowed into cliffs and hillsides, not packed under a freestanding stone mountain that has to hold its shape for millennia. So the engineering common sense that emerges from all this is fairly consistent. Large pyramids do contain internal spaces, burial chambers, passages, galleries, relieving voids, sometimes small side niches and symbolic shafts. These tend to be arranged along a small number of well-defined lines, descending, ascending, horizontal, connected to entrances to the heart of the structure and to key cardinal or stellar directions. They do not, as far as current evidence shows, include sprawling networks of random rooms deep under the core without some clear functional or symbolic logic. And that matters when we stare at scan results. If a new survey suggests a compact, rectangular, low-density zone above a known chamber, in a place where relieving spaces would make structural sense, the most conservative and likely reading is an engineered void doing an engineered job. If a study hints at a narrow, straight anomaly leading from a known passage toward the exterior, one might reasonably think of a blocked subsidiary corridor, a construction ramp remnant, or a symbolic shaft, depending on its angle and position. But if someone claims a huge, twisting, cavernous city under the exact center of a pyramid's base, with no clear entrance, no known parallels, and no obvious way the structure could survive being hollowed out like that, that should raise eyebrows. Not because it's impossible in some absolute sense, but because it cuts against everything we know about how these monuments were made to stand up. Engineering expectations don't tell us exactly what any given anomaly is. But they do give us a scale ruler for our imagination. They nudge us towards some interpretations, relieving spaces, short passages, small chambers tied to known axes, and away from others, vast hidden labyrinths under the core, unsupported giant caverns, unless and until truly extraordinary evidence appears. And this is where the tension lives. When a scan picks up something inside or below a pyramid, Is it one more piece of that quiet, sober engineering grammar? Or is it a sign that in at least one spot, the builders did something we've never seen before? To sort that out, we have to look at what people are actually claiming for the hidden structure under the pyramids, and how those claims line up or don't with the way these monuments were really built. When you actually start listing out the main possibilities people propose for any mystery void, the list is a lot less romantic than the headlines make it sound. On the most down-to-earth level, there are what you could call the construction and maintenance options. Spaces that exist because someone at some point needed a place to work, to move, or to let something flow. Think about how you'd actually build a pyramid interior. You don't just magically teleport blocks into the king's chamber. You need ramps, working corridors, cuttings in the bedrock where masons can stand, niches where you can temporarily tuck stones out of the way. Some of those get backfilled and vanish into the fabric of the pyramid. Some get sealed up and become invisible, unless you happen to scan the structure 4,500 years later with fancy physics. A compact, slope-matching cavity along a known construction axis could be a remnant of an internal ramp, or a staging chamber where blocks were turned, aligned, or stored. Something that was essential for getting the monument built, but never intended to be visited again. Then there are purely practical housekeeping voids. Drainage channels cut into the bedrock before construction. Sumps to collect groundwater. Small trenches that once connected lower passages to safer zones so water couldn't pool around the burial chamber. Egyptians were paying attention to water. They had to. If you're carving into limestone close to the Nile floodplain, ignoring seepage isn't an option. Some anomalies could be unfinished work, an attempted shaft abandoned when the rock proved bad or when the plan changed. Maybe a partially cut chamber that was never completed because the king died earlier than expected, and priorities shifted to closing up what was already usable. None of that requires a secret priesthood or lost technology. It just requires the messy reality of big construction projects, trial and error, adjustment, and the occasional dead-end corridor that never made it into the final official layout. But we're not dealing with a warehouse. We're dealing with a royal tomb in a religious landscape. So it's not surprising that some of the most interesting hypotheses are ritual ones. In Egyptian thought, the grave wasn't just a storage box for a body. It was a kind of interface between this world and the next. By the time of the Old Kingdom, texts are already hinting at a structured afterlife geography. The sky where the king joins the imperishable stars, the earth where offerings are made, and the duat, the complicated, often dangerous realm the dead must navigate. Later books of the dead and underworld texts, carved in New Kingdom tombs, make the duat look like a vast, layered landscape. Caverns, rivers, gates, guardians. The Pyramid Age is earlier than those texts, but the basic idea that the king's tomb is a model or gateway to an unseen realm is already there. So some scholars have floated the idea that certain tucked-away spaces might be symbolic underworlds. Not literal labyrinths to wander, but carefully placed emptiness standing in for regions the king must pass through. A small sealed chamber below ground level could represent the deepest, most hidden part of the earth. A narrow shaft pointing to a circumpolar star might embody the king's ascent. A blind passage that goes nowhere might not be a construction mistake at all, but a deliberate evocation of a gate that only opens in ritual. How far can we responsibly push that? We have to be honest. We don't have an Old Kingdom instruction manual that says, this void equals this part of the duat. What we do have are patterns. Certain directions and levels show up again and again with clear symbolic weight. North and east, the path of rising and circumpolar stars. West, the land of the dead, below ground, the hidden places. Above the burial chamber, zones tied to celestial transformation. So if a newly detected space sits in a position that echoes those patterns below the floor of a known chamber, aligned with a particular axis, it's not unreasonable to ask whether it had a ritual dimension, not just an engineering one. The key is to treat that as a possibility, not a foregone conclusion. A related cluster of ideas revolves around burials and cult installations. We know kings didn't go into the afterlife alone. There are subsidiary pits, boat burials, and small satellite pyramids around the big monuments. Some contain queens or high officials. Others hold symbolic boats, maybe intended for the king's journey with the sun god. There are storage magazines for grave goods, offering tables, chapels. Most of these features are outside the main core of the pyramid. But not all. At some sites you find hidden niches with statue groups, or small annex rooms that held ritual equipment. There are also examples of secondary burials in the broader complex. Favoured courtiers, priests or family members buried in carefully placed tombs that maintain a relationship to the king's monument. So one perfectly ordinary reading for a small, discrete void close to established passages is a cache, a sealed space for ritual objects, backup grave goods, or cult installations that only priests would have known about. In some later complexes, we even find foundation deposits, sets of ritual items buried at key construction points. Those are usually outside, but the principle of embedding ritual packages into the fabric of the monument is very old. Could a mysterious anomaly be an unrecognized subsidiary burial, tucked under or beside the pyramid to bind someone's fate more tightly to the king? That's not beyond the realm of established Egyptian practice. It would still be a big discovery, but it wouldn't overturn everything we think we know. So why, with all these sober, historically grounded possibilities on the table, do the really extraordinary ideas keep surfacing? Partly because the map is still incomplete, even at Giza, which has been studied for more than a century and a half. New rooms, new shafts, new tombs keep turning up. A lost causeway here, a buried boat there, a hidden chamber behind a false wall. Every genuine surprise buys a lot of credibility in the public imagination for the next wild claim. And some past surprises have been dramatic. Nobody was expecting intact, full-sized wooden boats buried in sealed pits by the Great Pyramid. Nobody predicted the bent pyramid would hide such a complex internal arrangement. When you've been wrong about what's possible a few times, there's a huge unknown thing starts to sound less like fantasy and more like history repeating itself. Then there's the basic human taste for stories. Possible relieving chamber above the king's chamber is accurate, but it doesn't quicken the pulse. Vast hidden hall of records under the pyramid does. Extraordinary explanations hang around because they're narratively satisfying. They promise a single dramatic revelation instead of a slow accumulation of cautious detail. So, how do we keep our footing? One way is to borrow a few simple tools from scientific thinking. First, simplicity. If a straightforward hypothesis, say, a construction void, or a relieving space already fits what we know about pyramid engineering and doesn't require rewriting Egyptian history, it deserves to be taken very seriously before we reach for alien vaults or lost super-civilizations. Second, fit with context. Any proposed function for a hidden space has to harmonize with everything else we see at the site. The layout of passages, the religious texts of the period, the wider funerary landscape. A theory that explains one anomaly but clashes with 10 well-established patterns is on thin ice. Third, testability. Can the idea, in principle, be checked? Could another type of scan refine the shape, the density, the connections? Could a small, carefully placed drill or endoscope someday confirm or refute it without damaging the monument? If an explanation has no imaginable way to be tested, it slips from history into pure speculation. When we apply those filters, The range of plausible, hidden structure interpretations narrows, but it doesn't become boring. It just shifts the excitement from fantasy towards subtler, but still profound possibilities. A cramped construction gallery, perfectly preserved. A sealed ritual cache with objects no one has seen in 4.5 millennia. A symbolic void that tells us something new about how the Egyptians imagined the journey into the duat. And always the open question, what if a given anomaly really isn't any of those? How do we tell a natural hollow from a human-made one? To answer that, we have to step even further back and ask what the ground itself is capable of doing under a pyramid, with no human help at all. Before we imagine secret tunnels and lost chambers, we have to remember what the pyramid is actually sitting on. Not a concrete slab, not a perfectly solid block, a hill of limestone. Limestone that formed on an ancient seabed, layer after layer of mud, shells and marine life compressed over millions of years. Limestone that has been fractured, dissolved, and rearranged by water for far longer than any pyramid has existed. It's a living, changing material on geological timescales, and it can produce shapes that, to our scanning tools, look uncannily like intentional architecture. One of the main ways it does this is through karst. Karst is what happens when slightly acidic water meets soluble rock like limestone. Rain picks up carbon dioxide from the air and soil, seeps into cracks, and very slowly eats its way along bedding planes and fractures. Over thousands, tens of thousands of years, tiny pathways widen into tubes, tubes into caves, caves into large chambers and sinkholes. Most of this is invisible from the surface, but inside the rock you can end up with pockets, ledges, dome-shaped roofs and snaking tunnels, all created with no human intervention at all. Some lie empty, others are partly filled with sediments or collapsed debris. Some are dry relics of an ancient water table, others still carry trickles of groundwater in the flood season. On scans, a dry karst cavity can present as exactly what it is, a lower density region, a negative compared to the solid stone around it. In muon data, that means slightly more particles are getting through. In radar or seismic data, waves speed up or slow down, bounce or scatter in ways that mark out a void. But here's the catch. Our tools don't label things natural cave or royal chamber. They only tell us that something down there isn't behaving like solid, uniform limestone. A rounded karst pocket, half filled with rubble, can look in cross-section like a lopsided room. A sinuous solution channel can mimic the signature of a corridor. A cluster of small dissolution cavities can blur together into a single fuzzy anomaly. Then there are fractures. Limestone doesn't lie underground as one endless, unbroken mass. It's arranged in beds, layers, and those beds are cut by joints and faults created as the rock was buried, bent, and uplifted. Some of those fractures are hairline, others are open planes you could slide your arm into. In places they can be widened by the same dissolving action that creates karst. From a scanning perspective, a continuous fracture zone can look like a narrow, elongated, low-density feature, a straight or gently curving stripe where the rock is more broken and porous than the surroundings. On a diagram that's disturbingly easy to see as a deliberately cut passage. Even bedding planes themselves can mislead. If you have a stack of limestone layers, and one of them is more cracked, more weathered or partially eroded than the rest, that particular horizon can show up as a horizontal anomaly, a band that stands out from the layers above and below. Slice that band in the right orientation, and it may resemble a long, flat void. So one category of explanation for mystery structures is simply this. You are seeing the skeleton of the hill. Natural joints and bedding planes perhaps slightly widened by water, impersonating corridors and galleries when turned into colourful slices and contour maps. And then we have features that are technically human-made, but not mysterious at all, quarry scars. The builders of the Giza pyramids didn't ship all their stone from far away. Much of it came from right there on the plateau. They hacked out massive blocks from the bedrock itself, leaving extraction trenches, stepped faces, and partially cut pits behind. Later construction could cover, modify, or build over those scars. Some of these old quarries are obvious at the surface. Others lie buried under ramps, temples, and debris. Deep extraction trenches, backfilled with looser material, can show up on scans as elongated low-density zones. An abandoned quarry face can look like a sharp boundary between full and empty, even when the empty is just a mass of softer rubble and fill. From a distance, and through the filter of remote sensing, a filled quarry trench under or beside a pyramid can masquerade as a hidden ditch, a long gallery, even a collapsed tunnel. So how do you sort this out? You start thinking in patterns. Natural karst doesn't respect human symmetry. Karst cavities tend to follow the flow of water and the grain of the rock. They meander, they cluster in zones of weakness. They often have irregular bulbous shapes with sloping roofs and uneven floors. Fracture networks are directional. They may align along one or two dominant angles set by the regional stress history, cutting straight across whatever a human later builds on top. Built spaces, by contrast, are usually locked into the architectural grammar of the monument. They track the cardinal directions. They align with existing corridors, with the pyramid's central axis, with known design modules. Their proportions are often constrained by block sizes, ceiling spans, and Egyptian preferences for certain angles and dimensions. So if an anomaly lines up neatly with the pyramid's internal geometry, same orientation as a known passage, same slope as a corridor, sitting on a level that matches other rooms, that bumps up the probability that it's man-made. If it slices diagonally across all that at some odd angle, or balloons out in a random lobe off to the side, the natural fracture or karst pocket explanation gets a lot stronger. Another clue is context. Is the anomaly part of a larger pattern of disturbed rock that extends beyond the monument, tracing a geological feature across the plateau? Or is it tightly nested within the architectural core, beginning and ending in ways that make sense only if you're following a design plan? Quarry scars have their own signatures. They tend to hug the edges of construction zones, wrap around the base of monuments, or sit in logical harvesting spots where good stone was available. A long, shallow trench leading away from the pyramid foundation at ground level is more likely an old extraction cut than a hidden ceremonial highway. But reality is rarely tidy enough to let us say natural or built and walk away. Mixed origins are common. A pre-existing karst cavity makes an excellent starting point if you're an ancient builder wanting an underground space. You don't have to carve everything from scratch. You can enlarge, shape, and dress the interior, turning an irregular natural hollow into a more regular chamber. The rock around it will still bear the chemical and structural fingerprints of dissolution, even if the final space has straightened walls. Egyptians were perfectly capable of reusing natural features. They followed wadis, exploited rock shelters, adapted caves. It would be entirely in character for them to take advantage of a convenient void under or near a pyramid, integrating it into their symbolic or practical design. From our point of view, thousands of years later, that creates a knot, a mixed cavity, part karst pocket, part chiselled chamber, part natural trench, part quarry cut, can produce scan signatures that sit somewhere between the neat categories. Not quite random enough to be obviously natural, not quite regular enough to scream intentional room. A blurred boundary that resists simple labels. And this is where the temptation to jump to the most dramatic story is strongest. A fuzzy, ambiguous space is like an ink blot. You can see whatever your imagination is trained to see: secret hall, lost archive, hidden tomb, or just boring geology. The real work for archaeologists and geophysicists is to hold those images lightly and keep checking them against what the rock, the architecture, and the wider landscape are actually telling us. Which brings us to the next piece of the puzzle. Not just what the ground can do, but how our interpretations travel from cautious data to confident headlines, and what gets lost or added along the way. By the time you hear about a hidden structure under the pyramids, the story has usually taken a long, quiet journey. It starts in a place that almost nobody sees, a preliminary result. That might be a draft technical report, a conference presentation, or a paper submitted for peer review. It will be full of caveats, words like preliminary, low resolution, model dependent, one possible interpretation. The figures will show fuzzy probability blobs, confidence intervals, alternative fits to the same data. Then comes the next step in the pipeline, the press release. Most research institutions now have communications offices. Their job is to translate dense, uncertain science into something a general audience might actually read. So those probability blobs become an anomaly. One possible interpretation becomes may indicate a previously unknown void. Some of the caveats survive, but many get pushed to the bottom, past the point where most readers will stop. The press release goes out, journalists, bloggers, science writers, and YouTube creators pick it up. They don't usually have access to the raw data or the full technical paper yet, and even when they do, they're working on deadlines. They scan the abstract, skim the figures, maybe pull a quote or two from the lead researcher. Now the story shifts again. May indicate becomes suggests. Suggests becomes reveals. The anomaly, which in the original work was a volume of slightly lower density relative to a model, is now a cavity, then a chamber, and for some, finally a room. And once it's a room in language, our brains can't help but furnish it. This is where visual persuasion steps in. Heat maps, contour slices, 3D renders, all of them are, at root, just ways of representing differences in data values. But our pattern-hungry minds see them as photographs. A smoothed zone of low density shaded in blue becomes, in our perception, an open, cleanly bounded space. A rectangular grid imposed for reference looks like walls. An isosurface drawn through a probability cloud turns into a crisp, solid ceiling. Rotate that render slowly, label it hidden void beneath the pyramid, and it becomes emotionally hard to remember that no camera has ever seen what you're looking at. It's a mathematical model, not an underground selfie. The words used in captions and commentary push us further down the slope. Structure, complex, network. They all sound architectural. But in geophysics and geology, those terms can be slippery. A structure might mean any persistent feature in the data, a fracture zone, a change in rock type, a region of slightly different porosity. A complex could be nothing more exotic than several overlapping anomalies that can't be cleanly separated at the current resolution. A network might refer to a set of aligned cracks or dissolution channels, not a carefully laid out grid of tunnels. The same vocabulary that a specialist uses to talk cautiously about patterns in noisy measurements can, in ordinary language, sound like a guided tour through an underground city. So how do you, sitting in bed with a video or an article, read these claims critically without needing a degree in geophysics? You start by asking yourself a few questions. First, what exactly has been measured? Density differences from muons, changes in wave speed from seismic surveys, reflections from radar. If the story never quite tells you what the instrument actually recorded, That's your first hint that you're probably looking at an interpretation several steps removed from the raw signal. Second, how sharp is the feature? Is it described in meters or tens of meters? Are the boundaries well constrained, or are you seeing a blob that could shift or smear if a different model is used? A void that might be anywhere within a 10-meter cube is a very different thing from a clearly defined 5 by 3 meter room. Third, how many independent methods see the same thing? If a muon study, a seismic line, and a radar survey all independently point to a similar sized low-density region in the same place, confidence goes up. If the anomaly only appears in one kind of data, and especially if it was spotted retrospectively, after people were already looking for something interesting in that area, caution is wise. Fourth, what alternatives have been seriously considered? Did the researchers discuss natural voids, fractures, quarry scars, and mixed cavities? Did they model how those possibilities would look in their data? Or did the narrative jump quickly from anomaly to hidden chamber without walking through the boring options first? You don't need to answer these questions perfectly. Just holding them in mind is often enough to slow the slide from maybe to definitely, and that brings us to a final important point. Being cautious about interpretation is not the same thing as debunking. It isn't about insisting that every anomaly is just a rock, or that ancient builders could never have done anything surprising underground. It's about matching the strength of the claim to the strength of the evidence, and being honest about the gaps in between. Responsible storytelling sits in that middle ground. It says, here is a low-density region detected under this part of the pyramid. At our current resolution, it could be a natural karst pocket, a quarry trench, a mix of both, or a deliberately shaped space. Here is why some interpretations are more likely than others, given what we know about the geology, the architecture, and the broader archaeological context. It leaves room for wonder, but doesn't cash that wonder in for certainty too early. Because if we let every fuzzy signal harden instantly into a hidden chamber in our minds, we rob ourselves of the more interesting, slower story, the careful work of testing, cross-checking, and when possible, gently peeking inside without destroying what we're trying to understand. So the next question becomes, how do archaeologists and geophysicists actually do that? How do you move from suggestion to verification? Especially when you're dealing with some of the most famous monuments on Earth, and you can't just start drilling holes on a hunch. The first step is almost always, do the same thing again, but better. If one survey hints at a low-density region, the response isn't to grab a drill. It's to bring in more instruments, more angles, and more cautious eyes. That might mean running muon detectors for longer, collecting more particles, so the image sharpens slightly. It might mean shifting the detectors to a new position, so you're looking at the same possible void from a different direction. It might mean laying out new seismic lines that cross the original ones, or running ground-penetrating radar with a different antenna frequency that trades depth for resolution or vice versa. Each method has its own quirks, its own kinds of illusions. But those illusions usually don't repeat in the same way across completely different tools. If a feature shows up in a muon dataset, then again in independent seismic measurements, and once more in radar profiles, archaeologists start to take it very seriously. Not as a chamber yet, but as a real persistent anomaly in the ground that multiple methods agree on. In parallel, the models get better. Researchers tweak their assumptions about rock densities, moisture content, and known tunnels. They build more detailed 3D models of the pyramid and its bedrock, plug in everything that is already mapped, and then ask, with all of that accounted for, does the anomaly still need to be there to explain the data? Sometimes, refining the model makes the void vanish. What looked like empty space turns out to be the combined effect of a slightly less dense fill material here and a known corridor there. Other times, the anomaly survives every reasonable tweak. It becomes a stubborn residue the models can't smooth away. Only when an anomaly persists through this kind of multi-method, multi-model beating up do people start whispering about the next level, physically looking inside. But even then, with the Great Pyramid or other iconic monuments, nobody is talking about tearing up floors or hacking through ancient masonry. The tools of choice are much smaller and much more surgical. One option is micro-drilling. This is exactly what it sounds like, drilling a hole typically no wider than a pencil, sometimes less, through a carefully chosen point in an already damaged or reconstructed area. The aim is to minimize new harm. You're not punching through pristine decorated stone, you're going through mortar, filler, or places where modern interventions have already altered the original fabric. Through that tiny hole, you can pass an endoscope, a flexible tube with a camera and light at the end. Endoscopes have been used in Egyptian monuments before. They can snake through long, narrow holes, bend around corners, and send back images from spaces a human could never enter. In the best-case scenario, an endoscope finds clear air, smooth work surfaces, or even architectural details that confirm you're looking into a deliberately made space. But micro-drilling and endoscopy are not casual steps. They're reserved for situations where the anomaly is robust across several techniques. The potential gain in knowledge is high, the point of entry can be chosen to minimize damage, and, crucially, the responsible authorities have agreed that the risk is acceptable. Sometimes even less invasive probes are considered. Fiber optic temperature sensors, for example, can be lowered into existing cracks or joints to see if there are air currents hinting at hidden spaces nearby. Tiny microphones can listen for subtle echoes when the stone around an anomaly is tapped. Groundwater chemistry can be sampled for hints of open voids. All of these approaches share a principle: touch as lightly as possible, and only after you've done everything you can from the outside. That caution is not just about scientific ethics, it's also about conservation, tourism, and politics. The pyramids are not isolated research objects. They're national symbols, major sources of tourism revenue, and part of a heritage that belongs, first and foremost, to Egypt. Any invasive work, no matter how small, competes with other priorities: stabilizing existing structures, managing millions of visitors, preserving painted surfaces that are visibly decaying right now. Drilling even a very tiny hole in a world-famous monument is not just a technical decision, it's a political and cultural one. This is where permits come in. No foreign team, and no domestic team either, can simply decide to test a hypothesis by putting holes in the Great Pyramid. Proposals go through the Egyptian Ministry of Tourism and Antiquities, and often through specialized committees that include archaeologists, engineers, conservators, and administrators. They ask hard questions. Is the anomaly solid enough to justify the risk? Is this the least damaging way to answer the question? What are the chances that something could go wrong? What will be done to repair or conceal the entry point afterward? How will the results be shared, and with whom? Sometimes the answer is yes. Proceed, cautiously, under supervision. Sometimes it's no. The potential harm outweighs the possible gain. Often it's not yet. Collect more data, refine your models, come back with a stronger case. From the outside, this process can look like stubborn secrecy or bureaucratic delay. From the inside, it is part of how irreplaceable monuments survive both the centuries and our curiosity. So what would confirmation actually look like in this careful, layered framework? At its strongest, it would mean several independent lines of evidence converging. Imaging methods agree on a void of roughly the same size, shape, and location. Modelling work shows that without such a space, the measurements don't make sense. A minimally invasive probe, if allowed, returns direct visual or physical data from inside. Images of a cavity, readings of air composition, perhaps a laser scan of internal surfaces. Even then there are levels of certainty. A blurry endoscope image might show rough stone and shadows, but no clear architectural features. That would confirm there is some kind of space here, but not whether it's a natural pocket, an old quarry cut, or a purpose-built chamber. A sharper look might reveal cut blocks, right angles, tool marks, or even inscriptions that would shift the weight strongly toward deliberately constructed space. If, one day, a tiny camera peers in and finds worked limestone walls, sealed niches, or an untouched floor of ancient debris, then hidden structure would be more than a headline. It would be a documented part of the monument's architecture. But even a negative result is a kind of confirmation. If a micro-drill finds only solid stone where a void had been modelled, or if better data erase a once prominent anomaly, that doesn't mean the work was wasted. It tightens the models, teaches researchers where their assumptions went wrong, and helps prevent future false alarms. Verification without damage is slow, incremental, and often unspectacular. It rarely produces the cinematic moment of bursting into a pristine secret room. Instead, it builds a layered case, one cautious step at a time, until the story we tell about what lies under and inside these monuments matches, as closely as we can manage, the hidden reality. And if, after all of that, a void beneath a pyramid does turn out to be real, the next question is the one that keeps people awake at night. What might such a space actually have been for? If you strip away the headlines and the wishful thinking, there are really only a handful of broad possibilities for what a confirmed void could be. The least glamorous, and maybe the most likely, is structural. Large stone buildings don't like to sit evenly on their own weight. They sag, they crack, they shift. Ancient builders learned very early that if you stack heavy blocks over an open space, you need to give the stones somewhere to push that isn't straight down onto a ceiling. That's what relieving spaces are. They're the gaps you build on purpose above a chamber or corridor, so the stress arches around it instead of crushing it. The Great Pyramid already has several classic examples. Above the King's Chamber there's a stack of 5 small rooms with rough floors and low ceilings. They're not places anyone was meant to visit. They're there to spread the load, to protect the room below. If a new void showed roughly that kind of geometry, long and thin, following the line of a known passage or chamber, tucked into the mass of the masonry, the best case, and frankly the most elegant reading might be. Another chapter in that same story. A relieving space tells you the builders weren't just piling stone. They were thinking in 3 dimensions about forces, weaknesses, and failure modes. Finding another one, especially in an unexpected place, would refine our sense of how far that engineering intelligence extended. But not every empty space in a pyramid needs to be about physics. Some are about logistics. Before a pyramid is a tomb, it's a construction site. For decades, maybe longer, it's a live project full of ramps, stair-like terraces, temporary platforms, and work corridors. Not all of those features have to disappear when the monument is finished. If you're dragging multi-ton blocks up a sloping internal ramp, you might carve a turning chamber to help redirect sledges around a corner. If you're hauling granite beams into place, you might open a spacious cavity to maneuver them, then block the visible entrance once the job is done. If you're quarrying stone from directly under the future footprint of the pyramid, you might leave pockets of worked bedrock that become entombed inside the final structure. Some of those working spaces would be cleaned up and filled. Others might simply be sealed when they were no longer needed, especially if they weren't reachable from any finished corridor. A confirmed void that doesn't line up with any known symbolic axis, but does line up beautifully with how would you actually build this, could be exactly that. A construction scar preserved by accident. The best case interpretation there isn't hidden treasure. It's something even more precious to historians, a frozen piece of the building process itself. Then there is the possibility most people quietly hope for, a space that was meant to be there in the final, sacred design. When we look at other Old Kingdom pyramids and royal complexes, we see more than just burial chambers. There are storage rooms for funerary equipment, corridors that seem to have no practical function other than mirroring mythical journeys. Subterranean galleries cut under the causeways, used for offerings, rituals, or storing goods needed in the afterlife. At Giza, the pyramid field sits in a landscape full of magazines, boat pits, and rock-cut tombs. Kings weren't buried with just a sarcophagus. They were surrounded by food, furniture, statues, ritual vessels, sometimes even entire solar boats. A deliberately shaped, sensibly accessible space, under or within a pyramid, could be another piece of that ritual machinery. It might have held reserve offerings. It might have been a symbolic underworld chamber, completing a vertical trilogy, skyward shrines above ground, the king's burial in the body of the pyramid, and a chthonic space below, linked in theology, if not by open passages. Comparable sites hint at these layers. The pyramid of Djoser at Saqqara snakes downward into a labyrinth of corridors and chambers. Later pyramids simplify that complexity, but traces of multi-room subterranean designs linger. A new void that echoes dimensions or alignments we see elsewhere would push interpretations in that direction, not random, not merely structural, but part of the ritual blueprint. Any of these options, structural, logistical, ritual, would have consequences for how we understand the people who built the place. A cleverly positioned relieving space could show that pyramid architects were modelling stresses more subtly than we assumed. That, in turn, implies foremen who could communicate complex plans, stonemasons who could follow tight tolerances, and a feedback loop where experience from earlier monuments was being formalised into rules. A preserved ramp cavity or work chamber would shine a light on labour organisation. How many teams needed access at once? Where did they stand? How did they move tools and materials around inside a half-finished mountain of stone? A void that looks messy by ritual standards might be a map of workflow instead. Even a small storage chamber can speak to planning horizons, to carve out extra space for goods you will never see again. Then seal it forever means trusting that hundreds of people over decades will follow a shared mental model of the project. It hints at schedules, inventories, procurement systems for everything from grain to incense. In a best-case scenario, the void becomes a microscope slide for the whole system. Proof that these were not just thousands of anonymous labourers hauling stone, but teams embedded in a deeply thought-out plan. And yet, even if a pencil-thin camera one day sends back sharp images from such a space, whole categories of questions would stay beyond reach. We might see blocks, but not the conversations that decided their placement. We might detect traces of organic material, but not the exact rituals performed there. We could infer functions from dimensions and parallels, but not the personal meanings they held for the priests, overseers, or workers who sealed that place shut. Without inscriptions, we'd have no names. Without extensive debris, we'd have only hints of how intensively a space was used. Even with perfect 3D scans, we'd still be guessing at the sound, the smell, the emotional weight of stepping into that void when it was new. In other words, a real void, interpreted in the best possible light, could revolutionize our technical understanding of pyramid building and add a new chapter to their religious and social story. But it would not turn the monument into an open book. And that gap between what we could know and what we'd still have to imagine is exactly where the more extravagant theories like to move in. Once you have an unexplained gap inside a famous monument, the human imagination does what it's always done. It fills it. For some people, the step from unknown space to lost civilization feels almost automatic. If the scans hint at a large, cleanly bounded volume, the story writes itself, a forgotten archive packed with advanced devices, star maps, or energy technology that predates Egypt by thousands of years. For others, the mind goes downward and outward. Miles of interconnected tunnels under Giza, an underground city where initiates guarded secret knowledge, maybe linked to Atlantis, maybe to visitors from somewhere else. These ideas aren't new. They're part of a long tradition of reading the pyramids as keys to a much older, much more advanced human past. In that story, the Old Kingdom Egyptians are sometimes reduced to caretakers. They inherit structures, patch them, add inscriptions, but the original builders are someone else entirely. Narratives like that are emotionally powerful. They explain gaps in our knowledge by appealing to something bigger than the evidence we currently have. They promise that the real story is still hidden, waiting to overturn everything. But that promise comes with a very heavy price tag, an equally heavy evidential burden. If you're going to argue that under the pyramids lies proof of an unknown technological civilization, you're not just making a tiny adjustment to the history of one site. You're rewriting the entire archaeological, geological, and genetic story of the last 10,000 years or more. You'd need more than a low-resolution anomaly on a scan. Extraordinary claims aren't wrong because they're imaginative. They're just doing something bigger than ordinary explanations, so they need more scaffolding to stand up. In practice, that means multiple independent lines of evidence, all pointing in the same unlikely direction. If some radically advanced culture built vast underground cities at Giza, we'd expect to see their fingerprints in a lot of different places. We'd expect their building materials or tools to look different from anything in the Old Kingdom record. Exotic alloys, machining marks that don't match stone, copper, or simple abrasive techniques. Consistent tolerances that push beyond even the most precise Egyptian masonry. We'd expect their debris. Construction is messy. It leaves broken bits, failed experiments, tool fragments, waste dumps. So far, every controlled excavation around Giza turns up the same kinds of things. Limestone chips, copper tools, stone pounders, pottery, food remains, worker villages, ramps, quarries, all solidly in line with a Bronze Age, Old Kingdom industrial landscape. We'd expect their ideas to leak. A civilization capable of engineering multi-kilometre underground centres under Giza would almost certainly have left traces of its language, iconography, or myth outside a single site. Rock art, portable objects, architectural echoes elsewhere on the Nile, or far beyond. Instead, what we see at Giza is strong internal coherence. The pyramid complexes, mastabas, temples and quarries all fit into a cultural package that makes sense for the Fourth Dynasty. Consistent art styles, consistent hieroglyphic forms, consistent burial customs, consistent logistics. Even the way stone blocks are dressed and laid speaks the same accent as other Old Kingdom works. You don't get sudden intrusions of techniques that scream a different era or a different technological base. You get gradual experimentation within a recognizable tradition. That's where the mismatch shows up most clearly. A hidden elevator made of alien alloys, buried in the core of the Great Pyramid, would sit like a thunderbolt in this context. It would have no lead-up and no follow-through, nothing in the long ramp of pre-dynastic, early dynastic, and Old Kingdom material culture prepares the ground for it. Nothing afterwards extends it. Those gaps don't make such a thing literally impossible. They just make it very, very hard to support without overwhelming evidence. And evidence in this context isn't one ambiguous data set that could mean several ordinary things or one extraordinary thing. It's converging proof. You'd want scans from different methods, muons, radar, seismic, all agreeing not just that a void exists, but that it has architectural features wildly foreign to Old Kingdom norms. You'd want direct access, boreholes, cameras, samples that can be independently dated and analysed. You'd want the materials in that space to be out of place in time. Radiocarbon dates clustering millennia earlier than the pyramid itself. Tool marks that don't match copper chisels and dolerite pounders. Organic remains from species not otherwise present in the Egyptian record of that age. You'd want knock-on effects. If Giza hid an older, more advanced layer, sites elsewhere in Egypt, or even beyond Egypt, would likely show hints of that same layer once we knew what to look for. Similar engineering signatures, related artifacts, parallel myths. Until multiple pieces of that magnitude show up together, standard timelines aren't being stubborn for the sake of it. They're doing what good models do. They stay in place while they keep explaining the most data with the fewest heroic assumptions. At the same time, it's useful to be careful about how we talk about all this. Fringe ideas often attract ridicule, and that can feel satisfying if you're tired of sensational headlines. But mockery doesn't actually help anyone learn how to weigh claims. It just swaps one emotional reaction for another. A more useful approach is to keep the door open in principle, and the bar high in practice. We can say, yes, if a chamber were found packed with unknown alloys, devices that show clear moving parts, inscriptions in a totally alien script, and if those artifacts dated securely to a period far earlier than any Egyptian state, then historians would have to revisit core assumptions about when complex technology emerged. We can also say that level of evidence would not be subtle. It would be obvious, testable, replicable, and it would change not just YouTube thumbnails but entire academic fields. Between those poles lies a wide space where uncertainty is real but bounded. An unexplained void? That's interesting. A void that lines up with known construction habits or religious patterns. That's exciting in a grounded way. A void that, even after careful study, still doesn't quite fit our existing models. That's a prompt to refine the models, to expand our sense of what Old Kingdom builders could do. It isn't, by itself, a license to throw out everything else we know, so we can let the mind wander a little. Imagine what might be waiting in untouched stone, and at the same time keep a simple rule in view. The more a story asks us to rewrite, the more solid, varied and repeatable the evidence needs to be. Holding that line doesn't kill the mystery under the pyramids. It protects the part that's genuinely mysterious from getting buried under stories that crumble as soon as you lean any real weight on them. By now, we've put a few important pieces on the table. We've talked about how the ground under Giza is not some perfectly smooth slab, but a complicated limestone plateau, cut with faults, old quarry scars, natural cavities and human-made shafts. We've looked at how the main scanning tools work in plain language. Muon radiography, watching how cosmic particles slow down or zip through stone, ground-penetrating radar-bouncing radio waves off boundaries. Between different materials, seismic surveys listening for how vibrations speed up or lag as they pass through rock and air. We've seen that when these tools spot something, it usually isn't a detailed picture. It's a contrast, a blob, a zone that behaves slightly differently from the surrounding rock. Turning that contrast into a headline, or into a story about archives, machines, or underground cities, requires a lot of interpretation. And we've walked through some of those interpretations already. Ordinary ones like relieving spaces, construction ramps left in place, hidden corridors that make architectural sense. More dramatic ones like secret libraries, Atlantean vaults, or infrastructure from some unknown civilization. So this is a good moment, right in the middle, to pause, take a breath, and quietly reset how we're thinking. Because new scan discoveries at Giza aren't going to stop. Every few months, every couple of years, you can expect another press release, another paper, another wave of thumbnails with glowing voids and red arrows. When that happens, you can build yourself a simple little checklist. Something you can run in your head before you decide what to make of the latest claim. First question: what exactly did they measure? Is it muons, radar, seismic data, electrical resistivity, something else? Each method has specific strengths and blind spots. Muons are good at telling you where the average density changes along a line of sight. Radar is sensitive to sharp boundaries, but struggles in wet or clay-rich ground. Seismic surveys hear differences in stiffness but can smear fine details. If the article or video doesn't say what tool was used, or treats all scans as the same thing, that's your first yellow flag. Second question: how different is the signal? Are we talking about a sharp, consistent anomaly that stands out clearly from background noise, or a faint departure that barely creeps above the margin of error? Solid science will usually give you numbers, uncertainty ranges, maybe even comparisons to known spaces in the same monument. Vague language like significant or massive without context is a sign to slow down. Third, has any other method seen the same thing? A muon hint that lines up with a radar contrast and a seismic reflection is much more interesting than a single lonely anomaly. When different tools, using different physical principles, converge on the same feature, the chance that it's just noise drops dramatically. When everything rests on one dataset, it can still be real, but it's early days. Fourth, what are the boring explanations, and have they been ruled out? Could it be a natural cavity in the limestone, a zone of fractured rock, a known construction pattern, like a relieving chamber, a change in block density, or an old quarry cut later built over? Careful teams usually spend most of their time testing these dull options before they even whisper about anything spectacular. If a claim jumps straight to the most exotic possibility without walking you through the ordinary ones, that's another reason to be cautious. And finally, what would have to change if the most dramatic version were true? If the suggested explanation rewrites whole chapters of history, but the evidence offered is one fuzzy blotch in one scan, the scale is out of balance. Big revisions can happen, but they ride on layered, repeatable, multi-method evidence, not on a single surprising image. Keeping that checklist in mind doesn't mean you have to shut down your imagination. It just lets you let it run without dragging you off a cliff. Because one of the reasons patient science feels slow is that it's constantly checking itself against reality. Instruments have to be calibrated, data have to be processed, reprocessed, and compared with controls. Interpretations have to survive peer review, replication, and the awkward questions of people who weren't involved in the original work. From the outside, that can look like foot dragging. A scan team finds an anomaly in year 1, publishes it in year 2, refines the model in year 3, maybe gets permission for a tiny endoscope drill in year 4, releases those results in year 5. Meanwhile, the internet solves the mystery in a weekend. Obviously, a supervolt from 12,000 BC. But that deliberate pace is exactly what keeps spectacular mistakes from hardening into facts that take generations to unwind. It's how you avoid tunneling into structural stone because someone misread a noisy radar return. It's how you avoid announcing a new chamber that turns out 3 years later to be a software artifact or a misaligned sensor. Slow and careful is frustrating if what you want is a dramatic reveal. It's much kinder if you think in centuries. The pyramids aren't going anywhere. The bedrock under them isn't going anywhere. We have time to get it right. So, as you listen to all this, you might find yourself leaning one way or another. Maybe you feel that almost every anomaly we've seen so far will turn out to be some combination of construction spaces, ancient quarries, and geology. Maybe you suspect there really are a few deliberately hidden rooms still waiting, not from an unknown civilization, but from Old Kingdom architects, with reasons we don't yet understand. maybe you still hold open a little space in your mind for something wilder, as long as the evidence earns it. I'm curious where you land if you had to pick the most plausible kind of hidden structure under or inside the pyramids based on what we've covered. What would it be, and why? A lost storage gallery, an unfinished passage, a symbolic underworld chamber we just haven't intersected yet? Or do you think all the real surprises are already behind us? Let me know your thoughts. And if you'd like to explore more mysteries in this same spirit, curious, open but evidence-hungry, I've put together a book that collects 12 of the most intriguing, still unresolved puzzles in archaeology and ancient history. Not just pyramids, but vanished cities, odd artifacts, and turning points in the human story where the data are rich but the answers aren't locked in. You can find it on the website linked in the description. There's a discount running this week if you want to grab it while you're still awake enough to remember. For now, let's ease back under the stone. We've taken our intermission, checked our mental tools, and reminded ourselves how to listen to new claims without either swallowing them whole or spitting them out on principle. Next, we'll turn to what Egyptologists are actually comfortable staking their reputations on, the solid, well-tested facts about Giza that any new scan result has to fit into, or else explain its way around. When specialists talk about Giza, they don't start from mysteries. They start from a framework that's actually pretty solid. First, the when and the who, big pyramids at Giza, sit squarely in the Old Kingdom, around 2600–2500 BCE, during Egypt's 4th dynasty. That's not a guess pulled from thin air. It's anchored in several overlapping lines of evidence. There are quarry marks and red construction graffiti inside the Great Pyramid's upper relieving chambers, work gang names that literally mention Khufu by his royal name. There are administrative papyri from the time of Khufu's successor, like the famous Wadi al-Jarf papyri, where an inspector named Merah describes transporting limestone from Tura to Akhet Khufu, the horizon of Khufu, the pyramid complex itself. Around the pyramids, you find foundation deposits, seal impressions with royal names, pottery styles, and burial customs that match the broader Old Kingdom pattern. Radiocarbon dates from wood, mortar, and human remains in the surrounding cemeteries line up with that same window within the wiggles you always get in radiocarbon calibration. The sequence of architectural styles, how mastabas, boat pits, causeways and valley temples evolve from Sneferu's earlier pyramids through Khufu, Khafre and Menkaure, follows a logical, stepwise development, not a random scatter. Taken together, these strands make it very hard to push the pyramids thousands of years earlier, or to hand them to some lost civilization. You'd have to explain why all the supporting evidence, the texts, the graves, the pottery, the radiocarbon dates, coincidentally mimic an Old Kingdom royal site in exquisite detail. Then there's the question of how such monuments were actually put up. Here too there's a lot that Egyptologists debate, but also a surprising amount they don't. We know the pyramids weren't built by nameless slaves worked to death in chains. That image comes more from later Greek writers and modern movies than from the ground itself. Excavations on the plateau have uncovered planned workers' villages, housing blocks, bakeries the size of small factories, breweries, administrative buildings, even cemeteries for the workers. The skeletons in those cemeteries tell their own story. You see signs of hard physical labour, stressed joints, spinal issues, broken bones, but you also see medical care, fractures that were set and healed, signs that injured workers were fed and tended rather than discarded. The diet was heavy on bread, beer and meat, not the starvation rations you'd expect for enslaved captives. Tools from the site are very much of their time. Copper chisels and adzes, dolerite pounding stones, wooden sledges, rope, and a variety of simple surveying instruments. Inscriptions from other sites talk about corvée labour, seasonal drafts of farmers and craftsmen who worked on royal projects when the Nile flooded their fields. Taken together, the picture that emerges is of a massive, organised workforce of free or semi-free Egyptians, mobilised through the state, supported with industrial-scale food production and basic healthcare. Logistics, too, are not a complete mystery. We have traces of ramps, transport roads, and harbour installations. We have Mera's log describing the movement of casing stones by boat along the Nile. We know where much of the local limestone was quarried right out of the plateau itself, and where higher quality stone came from farther afield. Different researchers argue about the exact ramp configurations and lifting methods, but almost nobody in the field thinks anti-gravity devices or advanced hidden machinery are needed to explain what we see. Inside the monuments, there are also firm anchor points. The Great Pyramid's internal layout, descending passage, subterranean chamber carved into the bedrock, ascending passage, Queen's Chamber, Grand Gallery, King's Chamber with its granite sarcophagus and stacked relieving spaces above, has been measured, mapped, and crawled through for centuries. Later additions and intrusions are also documented. Medieval exploration shafts, 19th century blasting, 20th century tunnels dug to chase rumours. Other pyramids at Giza show their own internal quirks. Khafre's has an internal arrangement that blends bedrock cut and masonry-built corridors. Menkaura's pyramid shows clear evidence of alterations and unfinished elements when his reign ended. Some tomb shafts and corridors across the plateau were reused in later periods or modified in Roman and medieval times for things as mundane as storage or as desperate as grave robbing. So when you hear about a new cavity or unexpected void, you can place it against that background, a landscape and a set of monuments that have original Old Kingdom cores, later ancient modifications, and relatively recent intrusions, all layered together. Why is there strong consensus on some questions and not others? Partly because of how many independent threads converge. The Old Kingdom date and royal attribution don't rest on a single inscription or a single radiocarbon sample. They rest on architecture, texts, art style, burial customs, stratigraphy, and multiple dating methods, all pointing the same way. To overturn that, you'd need new evidence, at least as rich and varied. By contrast, details like the exact internal ramp design used during construction, or whether a specific narrow anomaly is a construction void, a natural pocket, or a deliberately sealed space, those sit on thinner evidence. They're sensitive to how you interpret ambiguous data, to which models you favour, to the limits of the current scanning technology. So specialists hedge more. They talk in probabilities, not certainties, and you'll find multiple competing models sitting side by side. That's the space where new scans live. For an Egyptologist, a fresh muon anomaly near the Grand Gallery isn't an invitation to erase everything we know. It's a puzzle piece that has to slot into the established picture of 4th dynasty engineering, known passageways, and documented later disturbances. Maybe it turns out to be a relieving cavity aligned with stress patterns in the masonry. Maybe it lines up with a construction ramp trace, or with a known but poorly understood cut in the bedrock. In a rarer case, it could indicate a genuinely unknown void. But even then, the first hypothesis will be some kind of Old Kingdom feature we just haven't reached yet. In other words, new scan data are most powerful when they refine and sharpen this existing framework, not when they're used as a wrecking ball. That doesn't make them boring, it actually makes them more interesting. Because once you accept the solid ground, the time, the culture, the broad engineering approach, the real questions become quieter but deeper. Within that Old Kingdom world, what were the architects trying to do with any extra chambers or passages they left hidden? How do the internal spaces we know about relate to each other symbolically, ritually, structurally? That's where we'll go next, into the places where, even with all this consensus, the mystery is still very much alive. If you strip away the noise, what's left at Giza are not giant blank question marks, but a set of very specific, very stubborn puzzles. They're not who built this or what century are we in. Those are within reasonable bounds answered. The live questions are quieter. Things like, in what exact order did they build what? How did the sequence of decisions unfold year by year, problem by problem? Take the Great Pyramid itself. We know its broad outline. But did the builders always intend the final height and angle from day one? Or did they adjust the design as they went, reacting to cracks in the bedrock, subsidence, or political pressures from the court? Was the subterranean chamber always meant to be left rough and unused, or did it represent an abandoned early plan for the king's burial that got superseded by the queen's chamber concept, which then got superseded again by the final king's chamber? Right now, those are layered hypotheses. People build scenarios from tool marks, from minor misalignments, from how the passages cut through one another. But we don't have a detailed construction diary. What we have is the finished building and traces of how stress and workmanship change as you move through it. That's one of the core mysteries, the sequencing of choices hidden inside the stone. The same applies out on the plateau. When you walk it in your mind, you can ask, why exactly is the Great Sphinx where it is, slightly offset from Khafre's pyramid? Why are some boat pits closer to the pyramids and others along the causeways? Why does one mastaba cluster hug a particular quarry edge while another sits further back? Was the site planned as one integrated sacred machine from the beginning of Khufu's reign, with blank spaces reserved for Khafre and Menkaure? Or did each king inherit a messy, evolving project? Quarries already bitten out of the rock, earlier causeways dictating the angle of the next workmen's villages creeping into convenient spots, and then improvise within those constraints. We don't yet have a complete, high-resolution map of every cut, trench, ramp foundation, and abandoned tunnel under the plateau that would let us play that sequence back confidently. And this is where those small discoveries stop being small. A narrow shaft only 20 centimetres across, a shallow pit a few metres long, a seemingly trivial cavity behind a layer of casing stones. On their own, they sound like details. But each one can flip a bigger interpretation. Find a previously unknown vertical shaft that links two known levels of the pyramid, and suddenly one construction ramp model gains weight over another. Discover that a random pit actually lines up perfectly with an extended axis of a temple, and the whole logic of how the site was organised ritually starts to sharpen. Even a minor relieving cavity, a little pocket left above a passage to take stress off the ceiling, can tell you which parts of the structure the ancient engineers worried about most. That, in turn, hints at which spaces were already in place when others were added, and what the builders thought was worth protecting. In a landscape this dense with human activity, details matter disproportionately. That's why archaeologists get excited about incremental mapping of the subsurface, even when it doesn't lead to golden sarcophagi. Imagine slowly building a three-dimensional jigsaw of everything underfoot at Giza. Not just the big corridors and burial chambers, but every quarry face, every filled-in trench, every robbed-out shaft, every natural fissure that someone tried at some point to turn into a tomb. Piece by piece, that model would let you see patterns that are now invisible. You might notice that certain classes of tombs always cluster just above a specific bedrock layer, suggesting the builders were tracking geological horizons you can't see from the surface. You might find that what looked like a random scatter of pits is actually the ghost of a long-vanished construction ramp system. You might trace how later burials carefully avoid an area that, to us, looks empty, a hint that something important, perhaps now collapsed or buried, once stood there. Subsurface mapping at that scale is still a work in progress. Current scans can penetrate only so far with only so much resolution, and they're often limited by where you can place detectors or antennas without disrupting modern tourism or the monuments themselves. But the trajectory is clear. Future tech will do what it always does, get sharper, smaller, and more integrated. Muon detectors today need long run times and fixed positions. Tomorrow's might be more sensitive, able to differentiate materials, or to operate in tighter spaces within the pyramids themselves. Ground-penetrating radar may move from producing fuzzy slices to generating clearer volumetric images, stitched together over time as surveyors walk the plateau again and again. Seismic methods could become gentler and more precise, reading fine differences in density instead of just big contrasts between rock and air. Combine those evolving tools with drone-based photogrammetry, satellite imagery, microarchaeology of sediments and pollen, and you start to see a future where Giza is not just a set of visible monuments, but a fully modelled environment, bedrock, masonry, voids, fillings, and all the ephemeral traces that sit between them. Will that erase all mystery? Probably not. It will likely replace some blunt, dramatic questions with more subtle ones. Instead of, is there a lost hall of records under the Sphinx? The question might turn into, why does this seemingly minor corridor curve just here to avoid a natural fracture? And what does that tell us about the order in which the builders explored the rock? Instead of, is there a secret burial chamber? It might be, why was this small, undecorated cavity treated as important enough to reinforce carefully, while other areas were left rough? In that sense, the real mystery at Giza may never have been about hidden treasure spaces at all. It may be about inhabiting the minds of the planners and workers who stood on that plateau 4,500 years ago, making decisions under pressure, with imperfect information just like we do. And that's where a calm kind of wonder comes in. Not the kind of wonder that jumps from an unexplained blip in the data to a grand conclusion, but the kind that treats every anomaly as a question, not an answer. The kind that's willing to say, here is something we don't yet understand. Here is how it might fit into what we do. Here is how we could test those ideas without breaking what we're trying to protect. Wonder, in that sense, isn't the end of the process. It's the method. It keeps specialists interested in yet another resistivity survey, yet another crawl through a dusty passage with a fibre optic camera, yet another reanalysis of old excavation notes. It's the quiet patience to live with partial images and blurry signals, knowing that each pass sharpens the picture a little more. So, when we talk about hidden structures under the pyramids, the most meaningful version of that phrase might not be a single spectacular chamber. It might be the entire, still unfolding structure of choices, errors, corrections, and intentions that built Giza as a whole. And with that in mind, we can finally come back to the present and ask, given everything we've seen, the solid framework, the persistent questions, the power of tiny discoveries, what do the latest scans actually add to the story, and what do they still leave comfortably, productively unresolved? So, when you hear someone say, the latest scans prove there's a massive hidden complex under the pyramids, it helps to slow that sentence down and look at each piece. What the scans give us, in their most honest form, are patterns of difference. A muon detector doesn't see a chamber. It sees a region where more cosmic rays make it through than you'd expect if solid stone were in the way. Ground-penetrating radar doesn't see a finished corridor. It picks up a contrast in how radio waves bounce back from one zone compared to another. Seismic surveys don't discover a room. They record how vibrations travel a bit faster here, a bit slower there. All of that is real information, and it's valuable. But it's also indirect. By the time you turn those signals into a story about rooms and passages and complexes, You've already taken several steps away from the raw data and into interpretation. For the recent wave of hidden structure under the pyramid's headlines, the careful takeaway looks something like this. There are a few places in and around the Great Pyramid, and on the plateau more broadly, where multiple methods agree that something is different from the surrounding rock. In some cases, the data are consistent with hollow space, a void, a cavity, a zone of unusually low density. In others, the anomaly might just be a change in material, looser backfill instead of tight bedrock, a fracture zone, an old construction trench that was later packed with rubble and sand. So instead of picturing a crisp blueprint of a buried temple complex, it's more accurate to imagine a handful of blurry high-interest patches on a slowly sharpening map. What are the best supported interpretations if we line them up from quite likely to possible but speculative? Near the top of the list are mundane sounding things that fit well with what we already know about how the pyramid was built. Stress relief cavities above key passages, construction voids where blocks were arranged to lighten the load, short dead-end shafts that once held portcullis stones or helped workers maneuver blocks and were then sealed off, old quarry cuts that were later hidden when the plateau was levelled and built over. These explanations are not exciting in a treasure hunt sense, but they mesh comfortably with engineering logic, with other known examples in Egyptian architecture, and with the scale of the anomalies the scans actually detect. Further down the probability curve, but still within the realm of serious discussion, are small purpose-built spaces we haven't yet seen, an additional relieving chamber, a modest symbolic cavity, maybe a short horizontal corridor that ties two known features together. These are the kinds of things that would matter a lot to archaeologists trying to reconstruct construction sequences, even if they never feature in a movie poster. At the far thin end of the spectrum sit the ideas you tend to hear most loudly online: sprawling multi-level underground complexes, long decorated galleries echoing beneath the plateau, a single intact burial chamber of a lost king, still full of grave goods. Those scenarios are not logically impossible, but they would require much larger, clearer, and more numerous anomalies than the current datasets show. They would also have to fit into a physical volume that is already partly occupied by known tunnels, chambers, and the very dense core of the pyramids themselves. Right now, the evidence for anything on that scale just isn't there. The scans suggest here is a zone that deserves a closer look, not here is proof of a hidden city in stone. That may sound less dramatic, but it's actually a powerful kind of progress. It narrows the search. It says, if we're going to risk sending a small robot through a drilled micro hole, or if we're going to design a new non-invasive test, these are the specific cubic meters of rock where the effort is most likely to pay off. It also gives us a way to talk honestly about uncertainty. We can say with the current resolution, feature A is very likely to be some kind of void, probably modest in size. Feature B might be either a filled trench or a natural fissure. Feature C is too faint to classify at all. We need better data. That kind of graded language is less satisfying than a yes or no answer, but it's closer to how science actually operates on the ground, and it leaves room for your own curiosity to breathe. You can hold both ideas at once, that the pyramids have probably given up most of their truly massive secrets, and that there are still small, intricate, meaningful unknowns folded into their fabric. As you drift towards sleep listening to this, I'd love to know where you're listening from. Are you in a city, with traffic humming outside the window? Somewhere rural, where the night is quiet? Another country entirely, far from Egypt but sharing this moment in time. If you feel like it, you can leave a comment with the place you're in, and what you personally think is the most plausible hidden feature under the pyramids. A small relieving chamber, an abandoned passage, something more symbolic. Those reflections collected from many places are their own kind of map. If this calm walk through the evidence has been helpful for you, you can gently tap like or subscribe, or leave a comment. It helps more curious, sleep-seeking people find their way here, and it tells the algorithms that slow, careful wonder is worth surfacing. And if you'd like to go deeper into the deep past, there's also a book waiting for you, about 12 prehistoric secrets that shaped the human story long before pyramids and pharaohs. You can find it on the website linked in the description. No pressure, just an invitation. If your curiosity wants more to chew on once you're rested. For now, you can let the headlines fade a little. The new scans don't hand us a lost world all at once. They give us hints, edges and questions, exactly the sort of quiet, unresolved things that are good companions as you close your eyes and let the ancient plateau fade into the background of your thoughts.